Good morning, Molly. You're live.
Oh, good morning. Great. Sorry, everybody. I did not see a countdown.
No worries.
But welcome. Thank you for coming to this webinar. My name is Molly Browning. I'm the Technical Support Manager and the Japan Technical Sales Manager for Lalamon Brewing. And with me today to discuss biogenic amines is Dr. Sybil Krieger-Weber. Sybil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning to everybody. My name is Sibylle Krieger-Weber, and I'm working for Lalamon now for 25 years on coordinating the wine bacteria R&D, and so I'm very happy to assist to this seminar.
Thanks. So yeah, this is going to be a really quick overview and discussion about biogenic amines and looking especially at cadaverine. So we did some research. This is going to highlight the research we did in Lalamon Brewing, looking at different strains of lactic acid producing yeast and bacteria to see what levels of biogenic amines were produced, and then also do a deeper dive into what cadaverine is and explore a little bit of case studies. So kind of like a little detective story. But yeah, so how to improve sour beer production with sensory training, and then the focus is biogenic amines and the cadaverine case study. So for a quick overview, we're going to discuss what are biogenic amines and how do they make up sour sensory. We're going to look at the cadaverine case study that we have, and then talk about practical ways to reduce these compounds in sour beer production. And then lastly, we're going to have questions for Sybil. She is an expert in biogenic amines and has done a lot of work with our colleagues at Lalamon Oenology. So we thought it was really nice to bring her in and her expertise to give us like a full overview of what these are. So diving in, bacteria metabolism does have an effect on flavor from many different areas. As you can see, there's a lot going on here, but we're going to focus on these small compounds that are called biogenic amines that come from amino acids and how they affect flavor and potentially how they have some health effects too. So biogenic amines are a small class of organic nitrogen compounds, and they're found in fermented foods. So they're found in cheese and vegetables, and also in beverages, so in wine and beer. And we might not really know what they are, but you probably have heard at least of some of these. The most common ones are histamine, tyramine, cadaverine, and putrescine. Histamine in particular is probably one that people often see as relating to allergenic reactions in humans. So in that respect, at high levels, they can cause headaches and other health issues, broadly speaking, no matter where they're found in fermented foods or beverages. But in beer and in wine, at lower levels, they do have flavor and aroma effects that can affect the sensory perception of your beer. So these include masking, metallic or meaty taste, or other undesirable flavors and aromas that we'll dive into a little bit more. So how are they created? So an amino acid, which we see here, the free amino acid, it undergoes an enzymatic reaction known as decarboxylation via a specific organism. So this is primarily lactic acid bacteria. So this is why this is a big concern in sour beer production, because of course lactic acid bacteria is where, that is the organism that is creating the acidity in these styles of beers. So this results, the lactic acid bacteria interacting with the amino acid results in the release of CO2 and the biogenic amines. So you see this here. So the histamine decarboxylase, it goes through and it releases that histamine. So this makes the point that bacteria selection is crucial, because you want to know, well, does some bacteria produce more than others? How is this controlled? So all these questions we at Lalamon Brewing and Lalamon Oenology have been looking at. And on the brewing side of things, we decided to look at our lactic acid producing organisms, so our 2 bacteria and our lactic acid producing yeast, and then determine what levels of biogenic amines are created in what conditions. So as I said, this is an overview. We are going to have more detailed, this research is going to be presented in more detail in upcoming papers and presentations at different conferences. But broadly, we worked with a lab in France, and we made a kettle sour beer. And then we had, at different stages of the fermentation process, we took samples and then analyzed them for these biogenic amines. So right here, this control is just a Saccharomyces cerevisiae fermentation at these different stages of the fermentation, so 24 hours, and then at the final beer production, these are very low levels. So the LOQ is less than 2 milligrams per liter. For the Lactobacillus helveticus and the Lactobacillus plantarum, these were kettle soured, along with to view other strains, we brought in a brevis and yogurt, and then we fermented them after the kettle souring process with Nottingham. So then we took samples again at 24 hours and at beer. Also, we took samples at mid-fermentation, but they were similar levels. I don't want to over explain the levels on this chart. But broadly, and for the most part, these are quite low levels of biogenic amines. The outlier here, what we see is cadaverine, where you do see spikes, and particularly with the brevis and the yogurt, those are slightly higher than what we see in other samples. Looking at our lactic acid producing yeast, so this is Philly sour, which is a strain of Lachantia, and then Cerevisiae, which is a genetically engineered Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain. Again, low levels to non-existent of the biogenic amines. However, you do have this spike in cadaverine and right here. And these, just to say, all these samples were run in duplicate as well. So that's why you see two stages there. So how to put this into context, right? This is a kettle sour beer. Those were selected bacteria. So we looked at commercial beer examples that were either fermented spontaneously or were fermented with wild yeast. And then we compared those with a commercial lager. So we looked at more biogenic amines here. And this really brings into context why studying these and knowing your selected organisms is really, really important. Because here you can see in the spontaneously fermented Belgian beer and spontaneously fermented American beer, you have very high spikes of biogenic amines, right? So the 50 to 78 milligrams per liter, so this is ppm, of cadaverine, putrescine, those are quite high. And those potentially have the effects of either having some sensory effects to the consumer or maybe possibly some health effects, but mainly I would think some sensory effects more, so some masking or metallic flavors coming through. To further dive into this though, cadaverine is a really interesting one because its perceived flavor isn't just masking or metallic, but it can also be perceived as rotten meat or seafood even. So shrimp is one that is often described here. And this particular biogenic amine, it comes from the decarboxylation of lysine, which is an amino acid found in malt by lactic acid bacteria. And the reason this is interesting is because it's the case study that we wanted to focus on was a case study that we personally did within our within Lallemand Brewing, where we had a group of 21 tasters and we wanted to establish a threshold for this compound. So we did a sensory session with the Siebel sour sensory kit, which has cadaverine in there as a representative sample of a biogenic amine and what a biogenic amine can do. It's 100 milligrams per liter spike sample into 1 liter of light beer. And the interesting thing is 2 out of 21 tasters could identify a very strong seafood, shrimp, highly undesirable flavor. The rest of us, myself included, I got maybe a metallic but nothing that was extremely off-putting. But for two of our tasters, it was a very extreme experience that they do not want to repeat again. And this kind of follows through with the flavor intensity scale. So as you see here, from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being less intense, most tasters didn't think it was a very intense experience at all. However, there was 2 at least that said, no, this is very much an undesirable flavor. We do not want to repeat this. We also asked them to do a flavor description, and the question we asked is, do you have any comments about the beer with the cadaverous spike sample added? And again, there was noticeably different between the control and the spike sample, differences in mouthfeel and aroma, but then you also see shrimp or fish here, right? So it is very interesting that a few people can taste these very undesirable flavors, and for most people, it comes across as, you know, a light, just undesirable metallic or meaty flavor. So really quickly, some practical ways to reduce biogenic amines is to understand your organisms. So your sour beer production method, it is nice and it is crucial to know what lactic acid bacteria you're using. This is also important, not just for biogenic amines, but, you know, for your production in general, where you would know, okay, is this lactic acid bacteria, is this hop tolerant or not? What flavors will this produce? What is their optimal temperature to be held at? Because bacteria in general have very small windows of optimal temperature. And if you vary outside of that window, then you are potentially prolonging your production process, and or not producing the amount of lactic acid you possibly could. And then the ratio of organisms is important too. So understanding if you have more of one bacteria than another, for example, which one is going to outcompete. So that is something that is good to know. And then in the production process as well, when you select how you want to produce your beer, just understand that spontaneous fermentation versus kettle souring with no bacteria, the pros and cons of each of these production processes. And then always allow time for complete fermentation. And it is always very helpful to clean. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sybil, and we're going to ask some questions to her and gain from her expertise. And the first question, Sybil, that we're going to ask you is, what effect does pH have on biogenic amine formation?
Maybe I can first start what was our experience in wine. And first of all, it was a very personal experience for me, because I loved red wine. At a certain stage, whenever I was drinking certain red wines, I really got this kind of hot flashes just drinking only half a glass, and normally I drink more than 1 glass. And so I made my personal little examination, and all of these red wines, and red wines normally undergo a spontaneous, we call it malolactic fermentation, but a fermentation with bacteria. They are higher pH, so they are more sensitive to this kind of deviations, and all of these wines had really higher levels of biogenic amines. And nowadays I drink once in a year a glass of red wine, but I stay to the white wine with the lower pH. And so yeah, what does pH, and I think here we are at the topic, as on the biogenic amine formation, pH I think is one of the drivers, because the higher the pH, the more easy is the growth of the bacteria, the more you have a higher bacteria population and more bacteria which are dangerous, the more you get also the biogenic amine formation. So in wine, in the lower pH, in the white wines, we are quite safe. But on the higher end, if we are at pH of 3.678, it gets much more dangerous. And I suppose in beer, you are on the even more dangerous side. And there's a second effect. It's not the formation, but also the perception of the flavors, because the biogenic amines, they are in low pH not volatile. So if your first taste will be nothing. You may be getting this metallic kind of flavors, or perhaps a seafood shrimpy flavor, because I think that also depends very much on the matrix. So you get some dry mouth, but then on the second part, at least in the wine, because your saliva has the high pH, so this kind of biogenic amines get been liberated, and then you get the full negative expression of that flavor. And very often the customer cannot describe it. He just dislike it, and they don't take another time the time to really drink that beer, because he just dislikes it. And if you want to know how it tastes, I always explain my students, if you have a kind of swamp, you clean your dishes and you don't wash it regularly, it's 3 days in the sink, what happens? And smell on it. And then you will have exactly that putrefaction, cadaverine kind of flavor. It's denaturation of proteins, and it's quite awful.
Yeah, that's very interesting too, because a lot of sour beer production, that it hovers around that 3.5 pH, and anything kind of lower, a lot of people are, oh wow, that might be too acidic. But in fact, that, to your point, that might be safer. And we saw that with sour VCA, and that fermentation, sour VCA regularly gets down to a pH of 3. So it is a safer option there. The next question is, what effect does alcohol have on biogenic amines?
So that's a secondary effect. I think people who are sensitive to the biogenic amines, that's not all of them. There is one dimension which is really the negative impact on the flavor, this metallic taste, or the shrimpy taste, what some customers can perceive more easily than other ones. But the other one are really the people who are sensitive. And if they drink this beer with higher levels of biogenic amines, normally our organism is able to degrade that biogenic amines by an oxidase reaction. But if you are sensitive and alcohol plays in, alcohol limits this body-owned reaction, or slows it down, and then the body itself is much longer exposed to the critical biogenic amines. So the reaction is much higher in presence of alcohol, and obviously beer and wine, they have alcohol, so you are more triggered by that kind of compounds.
Mm. And then the third question is, are there any regulations for biogenic amines?
Actually, in wine, we had an intense discussion about it, because Switzerland, 10 years ago, they had a recommendation, and it was on histamine, because on a toxic level, because the reaction is toxic. So you can get hot flashes, you can get headache, you can vomit if you are a sensitive person. So Switzerland putting a regulation, histamine on the toxic level is the most toxic biogenic amine. So they put limitation from 10 milligrams per liter of histamine for wine. And I had a lot of calls from especially Spain with the high pH Tempranillo wines, which had been blocked by Swiss regulation. But Swiss stepped now back, because OIV, that's our Office International du Vin, so it's regulating for most times parts of the world what we can do in wine, what is allowed in wine. And OIV was discussing, so the Germans always being very strict, put the level of histamine down to 2 milligrams per liter. The Southern European countries had been a little more on the higher side, 15 milligrams, so huge discussion. And finally, they decided not to put any legal limits for wine on place, because it's also only a part of the population which is sensitive, obviously, but they introduced good manufacturing practices which indicate you should use selected yeast, selected bacteria, which had been approved not to produce this kind of compounds. They proposed an early inoculation with selected bacteria just to limit production of biogenic amines in wine. The only regulation for biogenic amines in food is actually for fish. And but I always think there is no limitation necessary, because if you have a degradation of fish, you will smell before the regulations actually turns in. But there is the only regulation which is nowadays in place.
Thank you. So, and thanks for everybody. This is thank you to everybody who kind of supported this research. Please feel free. I forgot to say this earlier, but send questions in the chat, and Sybil and I will be happy to answer them. You can also send any questions to me. My email is down there below, and I'll be happy to direct them on to Sybil or to whoever is most appropriate. So, thank you, everybody, and we're here for your questions. Okay, let's see. I don't see questions that have been submitted. Rich has a question, so he's kind of curious about a production of amines in Belgian-style ale strains. He worked in a employee in the past that would have a difficulty breathing after copying certain Belgian strains. Oh, interesting. Oh, wow. I do not know about with the Belgian style ale strains. And if that would be, it does sound like it is an allergic reaction, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what kind of biogenic amine or where that would have necessarily come from. Let's see who else has. Yeah.
I think there is one publication, an earlier one from 2003. This publication talked about biogenic amines measured in the beer fermentation, and they had data from Belgium beer samples.
Yes, I remember reading about that.
So if you want me, I can send that reference through. I think that they namely or mentioned mean levels above 20 milligrams of tyramine and close to 10 milligrams of histamine. But in the abstract I have just in front of me that they did not detail other biogenic amines, but I'm very sure if histamine and tyramine is high, then all the other biogenic amines, especially putrescine and cadaverine, are also high. And I think especially
it's really interesting.
A higher lysine level, because it always depends on the amino acid as a precursor. So these levels might be even higher.
Yeah, lysine is becoming very interesting. And like beer naturally has higher lysine levels with the an all malt wort, of course. So yeah, so that's always a concern. Can you explain the sensory kits? How do they work? Yes, so Sybil has some sensory kits that you can purchase through that link below. They are small little vials that each vial will spike 1 liter of beer. And with the sensory kit comes a booklet on how to spike and what the compounds are, what the threshold is in beer. And then you open up the vial, we use like a light beer. So, and then spike it with that. And that's how you'll be able to taste. And usually the kits are 3 times the threshold level that you will see in beer normally. And that's, those are indicated on the pamphlet. Are there specific flavor markers for biogenic amines other than cadaverine? I think it depends on the person. I mean, I get more metallic and meaty, but yeah, Sybil.
I think it depends very much on the matrix. I know it from wine because we developed a wine kit, not as nice and sophisticated like the beer one. We made it a little bit, it's more homemade, but we went to wineries. I remember we started in 2004 and we had been on a trip and we went to the wineries and asked them always, give us your wine. And then we spiked the wine with, yes, about 20 or 30 times above the threshold. And it's very interesting to see how the wine changes from the wine which is really clean and fruity to a wine where even the varietal flavors, which are very important for wine, and I think also for sour beer, it has quite a flavor bouquet, is suddenly completely leveled down, and you just stay with most time this kind of metallic flavor. But obviously, matrix plays in, and it depends on your matrix. But it's very nice to see it in your own beers. And then you can have an idea how it develops.
Yeah, what levels. This is a corollary question from Randy. Can you recommend a lab that can analyze finished beer for biogenic amines? Are there any biogenic amines that can be present at high levels without sensory detection? Yeah, there's several labs. We worked with a lab in France, IFBM. I'm not sure how their prices for a brewery would be, but this was analyzed through HPLC UV, I believe. So I think there might be other avenues. And for us, what we saw was cadaverine was the one that, if it's present even at a moderate level, will have a very big sensory impact. Are there any biogenic amines that could be detected without the sensor? Sorry, your question just went away, so now I'm like, oh.
No, but I think really that depends on the person. If you are not sensitive or not trained, you might not detect it. You might just feel it. It's not opened, or it's bitter, or it's astringent. But you cannot correlate it, to the real origin of that deviation. So yeah, I think that's why the kit is so great. When we started with the kit in wine, we showed it to the winemakers and they said, wait, I think I have a wine in one of my barrels or in the tank, and picked it up and said, this might be going in this direction, and he could not explain before why it was so unpleasant. So yeah, I think it's also the training.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also like histamine at a high level might not have as big a sensory impact as maybe like a health impact. So like the heat flashes you might see more easily, perhaps. I do not know. I've not tasted anything with a very high level of histamine that I know of.
Yeah, no, certainly histamine is the one which is also in clinical studies sometimes put on the scale. But it's also sure because all the biogenic amines are degraded in our body by the same system. So if you have higher levels of other biogenic amines, they also block the degradation of histamine. So again, the person being sensitive is longer exposed to the toxic concentrations.
That's a really good point, Sybil. Yes. We are almost out of time, but we want to get through these questions. So do we know if starting gravity affects the amount of biogenic amines produced? I would assume that more malt means more precursors, therefore more biogenic amines. Yeah, I think as Sybil was commenting, depending on the matrix, because they're amino acid based, so I would imagine like an all malt wort having a lot of free amino nitrogen would probably typically present more. However, what we saw, this is why your selection of lactic acid bacteria is very important. From the study that we did with our bacteria, you saw that there was hardly any biogenic amines created, and that was from an all malt wort. So I think it is important, but maybe not as important as knowing what bacteria you have. Sybil, what do you think?
I agree fully with you. And normally in normal beer fermentation, you are working much cleaner than in enology. In enology, we are safe by the pH, or we feel safe by the pH, so we let nature sometimes go. Whereas in beer, I learned, you are cleaning, you are
do all the cleaning
from the wild flora in a brewery. I think, at least in the breweries, I know you can eat from the floor. The winery, I would not. So I think, there might be the risk less, but if you go for spontaneous fermentations, especially there, on this side, beer is more dangerous because the original pH is much, much higher. So you have much higher potential that if something which is not secure or challenging, dangerous, will grow, the potential for deviation is bigger than in wine.
Yeah, I agree with that. So last question. Which sensory markers for a sour ale are a giveaway that the sour will not age out of funky smells? Is it the same for normal beer? So he doesn't really play around with sours that often. They're a really small brewery. Sensory markers are sorry. I would say it's not really a biogenic amine, but from my experience, acetic acid is one that's hard to, like, if it's an acetic acid bomb, I think that's very difficult to blend away and or to sell. So those would be, if I had those barrels, I would be dumping those barrels. For biogenic amines, as someone was saying, I think it's a little bit more, depends on the matrix, but also depends on like how you taste it as well. How your body is able to detoxify it. But Sybil, what do you think?
Yeah, I think acetic acid is much easier to perceive because it's more obvious. The biogenic amines, they are more, in the retro, in the aftertaste, you cannot really put the finger on it. So it's just rather a dislike, and then you don't drink it anymore. At least that's what we know from wine. They just step away and look for something better.
I would say the caveat to that is cadaverine from what we've seen just in the field. And I know there's this brewery in Australia that has similar experience where only 2 out of 20 tasters for them really picked out a very strong shrimp seafood flavor. But from the tasters from them and our tasters, that flavor was so undesirable that the beer was undrinkable, but they were like, I don't think I want to drink anything for a while now. So it was a very visceral effect.
Yeah.
So that's one. And your soap example, your dish soap example, that's a perfect way to kind of correlate that to an everyday experience. Yeah. I think that's all the questions we have for everybody, but feel free, if you guys have any more questions, to email me, and either I will answer or I'll send them along to Sybil if I don't know the answer, or we will both answer. We're here. But thank you so much. We really appreciate the time. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
Bye-bye.